So, Dr. Riess, I'm thrilled to have you today, as I mentioned in the introduction, because I think this is such an important topic. And I just want to get started by asking you a little bit about how you got interested in this whole area of empathy and studying and teaching empathy.
Well, Janet, thank you for having me. And it really stems way back early in my life. My parents were part of the World War II, casualties, and I grew up with a strong sense of when people are mistreated, how traumatic and how enduring those experiences can be, and how many extra challenges that poses for people. And, I always had an eye toward a healthcare profession, I think, particularly because of a need to try to help people who are hurting and suffering. And then my interest in psychiatry really led me to having the most intimate conversations with people and learning what's the impact when any person, whether they're a worker, a clinician, a patient, a person in a business organization, what's the impact when they are not understood? Because I always believed if we understand people's backstories, we have way more generosity and way more ability to really connect and work more collaboratively.
Yeah. So we keep using this word empathy. I mean, it's definitely a buzzword in the business world, and it's like, oh, well, doctors need to have more empathy, or leaders need to have more empathy. How would you define empathy?
So, empathy, I think, is one of the most misunderstood concepts. So I'm glad you're asking. It's really a capacity. Some people think it's just a feeling that you just feel bad for people, but it's a capacity that involves a lot of cognitive perspective taking, like trying to imagine what is this like for this other person, and also the automatic feelings that we have inside when we see somebody suffering or in pain. So it's a combination of like perceiving what people are going through, processing that, and motivating a caring response. So it's really kind of a loop, not just a static thing.
Yeah, and that's a really great way to actually put that. And what I'm thinking of is I'm thinking of these cliches of "I feel your pain," right? I mean, really, that's kind of what you're talking about. Can you feel someone else's pain if you haven't been through it?
That's a wonderful question because there was research done in the mid 2000s where neuroscientists actually looked at the brains of people who were seeing other people in pain. And our own pain receptors light up when we see somebody else suffering. The phrase, I feel your pain, is really not just a figure of speech. So, like, if I saw you stepping on glass, the parts of my body that if you stepped on it with your foot, that area in my brain would be lighting up in pain.
Wow.
And it's just fascinating because we
It is.
really are wired to
Right.
feel each other's pain, and it's for two reasons. One is to help the person, and the second is to teach us don't step on glass. So
Right.
because if we didn't feel any pain, we would think like, oh, I guess that's an okay thing to do. So it's really hardwired into us.
I imagine that would be the case. I also wonder, I think about leaders in organizations, right? And they're told be more empathetic. I'm assuming doctors, right? You work with the medical profession, and be more empathetic. And yet there's a need in some of these professions to be a little bit more, what's the word, distant or unattached. I would think would have,
Right.
right? I mean, so the doctor, I mean, a surgeon who's going to have, you know, operate on someone can't have that attachment. Same thing with leaders. If I may lay you off at some point, or I have to work on your performance, do you think you can teach people to become more empathetic in these settings?
Well, our research definitely shows that that can happen. And this idea of compartmentalizing, which leaders and physicians need to do, is really important. So empathy is not like a spigot that you turn on and you just have it at the same level constantly all day, every day. It's definitely a mutable trait. And we are most empathetic when we're not stressed, when we can perceive, what other people are going through, and when we have the internal resources to respond.
Mm.
And as you say, you don't want a surgeon thinking about the pain that the person's in while they're doing an operation. You want
Right.
them focused on the task. So there are times when empathy is not useful. With leaders, they need boundaries to be effective leaders, so they can't be emotionally involved in every person's situation or, challenges. But having an inkling when somebody in your workforce is going through a rough time, facing a death of a parent, or God forbid a child, or
Right.
somebody very sick, or having people to take care of, empathy would mean that you show enough curiosity to say, we want to support you. What do you need to do your job? And sometimes maybe a person needs time off, or sometimes a person it needs to actually get a different job. So the caring hopefully leads to a collaborative conversation where you're not taking on the burden of the person, but you're trying to solve what their needs are to be effective in the workplace.
Can you teach this? Like, how to balance that, how to be more empathetic. And the other word I'm thinking of as you talk is there's attunement that's required as well, right? Attuning, being attuned to other people. So are all of these things teachable?
Yes. So the answer is, for the most part, yes. Empathy is now considered a teachable skill. I will say there is a small percentage of the population that does not have the neural networks for it. Some of these people are sociopaths. Some of these people are
Mm.
incapable of feeling pain of others. And I'm not talking about that very small percentage. I'm just talking about the vast majority of people have a capacity for empathy. And the teachable part is what we do at Empathetics is we train people in emotion detection, in learning how to interpret nonverbal cues, and specifically learning accurate ways to perceive what people's facial expressions are revealing, because we make the biggest mistakes when we're not looking at a person's face and we're assuming that they're angry when maybe they're sad. So these mistakes really move us away from empathy and move us into judgment. So
Mm.
your word attunement is exactly what we're teaching. How do you remain curious? How do you remain open to learning? Like, I'm not sure I understand you. Could you say more about that? Instead of, well, you seem angry, but you have no right to be angry. We're treating you so well here. And
Yep.
that's where you really start forming rifts.
As you talk about that, I would assume that some people listening are thinking, okay, but isn't empathy innate? And isn't and wouldn't that be fake? So if I'm trying to manipulate you by figuring out, well, what do I need to do right here? I'm not really feeling it. What would you say to those people?
I love when that question comes up, because when we were first doing empathy training with physicians and clinicians, we would hear this like, aren't you just teaching them how to act empathetic? Again, neuroscience backs us up, because part of the empathy training is making a meaningful eye contact with this with a person, and not trying to manipulate them by reading their facial expression, but really trying to understand, like, where are they coming from? What's the emotion here? And when people start doing these things and like taking notice of the posture of a person, like all of these nonverbal communications and how they're affecting us, we can actually become more empathetic just because we're paying more attention. It's like opening a channel.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I think this is true for leaders and for physicians, is that they have such a cognitive load to like make the right choice, to make the right decision that's going to have an impact maybe on a whole organization or on a person's entire health. And sometimes all of that cognitive activity moves us away from the more affective or emotional part of people. It's not that leaders are lacking. I think sometimes that what they're thinking about is so tantamount to the success of an organization that they forget that the true success is having happy people working with you and for you.
That's such an important point. And I'm going to highlight what you just said because I think it's so relevant to even a lot of the work that I do, that concept of the high cognitive load. Because I talk to executives all the time that they'll say, they're getting feedback. You need to be more empathetic. You need to stop and ask people how they're doing and all of that. And they'll say, and people will say, you don't care. And the response, and I just heard this last week, the executive will say, well, of course I care. I care. I'm just got so much on my mind.
Many times people, and this goes for leaders and all clinicians, they think that if they show caring, it's going to take too much time.
Right.
That
Yes.
somehow this is going to be, a 10-minute thing, a 30-minute thing that they don't. So they're afraid to say, how are you? But
Yeah.
they
It's going
don't
to go into this
realize
long thing. Right. Yes.
they
Sorry. I
don't realize
interrupt
that
you.
most people know how busy executives are, and they know doctors are just off the charts busy. So if you say, how are you? Or like, how was your daughter's graduation? Or how was the wedding? They're not going to start talking for 20 minutes. They're going to say, thanks for asking. It was really special. Like sometimes people don't realize it's just a touch point of seeing someone as a human being rather than just another worker. One of the things that physician leaders are now encouraged to do is to go on rounds with the clinicians and actually see what their day is like. And that is totally transformational. Where all of a sudden you're out of your front office, but you're seeing what the work is that your people are doing. And that, when you said earlier, isn't it easier to have empathy when you've walked in those person's shoes rather than trying to just imagine? And it absolutely is. When you have walked in the shoes of other people, empathy comes much easier.
And it goes back to the attunement. I mean, it helps you become more attuned to what's going on in your organization, which helps you with whatever it is you're doing anyway, right? So, I mean, it's also connected, but I think it's the time thing. I mean, people will always say, I wish I had the time to do that.
Well,
And
some leaders decide that they're going to make the time. And one physician leader actually started showing up, but he stopped wearing his suit. He started wearing what the people in the organization were wearing so he wouldn't stick out so much. And at first, people were just very distant and like, oh, And then he started hanging out in the coffee room. And before you knew it, he was getting the true scuttlebutt about what people liked, what people didn't like. And he was able to make the tiniest changes that made the biggest difference in his organization. Sometimes we have to get out of the ivory tower and walk the walk.
yeah, and it's eye-opening. I mean, I think that's the other piece is being in touch with what is going on. So, I mean, great story there. What do you think are some key things that a leader can do if they want to become more empathetic? So practically. So you talked a little bit about some of them, the walking around, all of these sorts of things, but is there anything else?
I think a place to start is like to just say I'm going to be more empathetic is sort of like I'm going to start exercising, like until you decide what day and where you're going to do it and for
A
how long. It's
plan.
just an
Right.
idea,
Right.
right? I would say a really helpful place to start is think about someone with whom you have maybe a little bit of a conflict. Like maybe they're coming late to work all the time, or maybe they're not meeting deadlines, or it can be anything. And we naturally tend to go into judgment and assumptions. When you choose a person where you could engage some curiosity and say, what if I just got to know that person and just said, how are things going? And instead of starting with, I'm noticing you're late or like whatever they're not doing, just say, I'm just curious. How are things going? Are you happy here? And you might be surprised to hear that there is a backstory for why somebody's either disengaged, distracted, worried. I had this happen myself with went back when I was doing research, and one of the team members was always missing deadlines. And everyone loved this team member, so nobody was like jumping on the person but I finally had to call and say, I just want to understand, is the work still interesting to you? And then I found out she had this medical condition that she didn't want to, quote, burden the team with.
Wow.
And it meant that she was going for like a number of weekly treatments. And see, empathy would have really helped if she said, I've got something, I don't want to go into it, but it's going to mean I'm not able to be as, timely as possible. But when I approached her with empathy, it was like, can you just tell me, are you still engaged? Like, how, and then I got the backstory, and then everyone pitched in to help.
Right.
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 So,
And that could be like you said earlier, transformational for you as well. It's like, wow,
yeah,
why didn't I ask? How I didn't know. How would I have known?
right.
Or she
And
didn't feel comfortable telling you. I mean, all of those things.
and people are so different. Like some people would tell the team right away, I've got this thing, it's good. And other people are like so worried about burdening people that they keep it to themselves. And then inadvertently it becomes a burden because they're not meeting their deadlines.
Yeah.
So we have to appreciate how differently people, respond and react to their own challenges.
So people who you just talked a little bit about advice. Is there any other advice you would give people who are thinking, oh, I do want to do this. I do want to be more empathetic. And some of the things you just mentioned, I can try, but is there anything else that you would tell them that you haven't said?
I think one of the really strongest ways for people who really want to be more empathetic is to give permission to people that they trust very closely to give them feedback on how they come across.
Mm.
And now this requires a tremendous amount of trust, but most top leaders do have their first rank or second rank people, and they usually have a person that they really have cultivated trust with. And to just say, I realize I'm not as empathetic or tuned in or attuned to people in this organization, and I want to do better. But I need a mirror because I'm kind of blind to what I'm doing. I'm just being myself. So, could you give me some examples where you may have observed me doing something where I didn't show empathy or where you felt a little bit of extra something might have made a difference? Because, I also often say learning empathy is sort of like learning ballet. You have to do it in front of a mirror because if you're just trying to learn steps or positions and you get no feedback, how are you going to know if you're doing it right? And most of us have a trusted colleague. And when we show our own vulnerability and say, I want to do better at this, it makes us more human. It doesn't mean we're now diminished in that person's eyes. It means that we are really open to learning and want to get, feedback. And these are delicate things. And I think it's hard for leaders who think they have to be perfect to actually ask for this kind of help. But it's the exact thing they need to do, which is to admit to themselves, I want to be better at something. And I've gotten to the top of my game in business, but I haven't gotten to the top of my game in my interpersonal relationships.
Oh, no, I love that. I think this whole concept of the mirror is so important because we don't see it. And then we see it sometimes after the fact. or, when somebody gives us the feedback. And what I find, Dr. Riess, is that a lot of people are really surprised when they get the feedback. It's like,
Yeah.
really? That was not my intention. Or, right? It's not, wow, I didn't realize that I came across that way. And so, but, and also giving people grace, I would think of, it's going to take practice. It's not going to be a light switch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it so much as a leadership coach, is intention. If you start your day intending to be more open, more curious, less judgmental, and you actually put a sticky note on your computer or something with that intention, that every time you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, I need to back off, and I think the curiosity is really the
Yeah.
key.
I agree with you. And I can't agree with you more. It's just not jumping to conclusions right away. So I agree with you. So this has been phenomenal. I think you've given us some practical advice and practical actionable things that people can do. So let me ask you, is there anything that I haven't asked you, any parting words of wisdom that you'd like to leave us with that I may not have addressed, or you may not have addressed today?
Well, Janet, I think we are in very turbulent times at this moment in history. There are wars going on. There's unrest in our own country. There's so many challenges, and people are just so polarized and finding many reasons not to connect, or to like hunker down and, you know, kind of withdraw. And at the heart of it, most people long for connection and a sense of belonging. So I would like to leave the parting message that it's more important than ever right now to help your people feel like you value them. Nobody's perfect, but try to look at what people are doing for your organization and for you. And if something's amiss, just really try to engage your curiosity or get someone to check in with somebody before people are walking around with more animus and more judgment and acrimony, and really think about, there's the saying, like, everyone is fighting a battle you cannot see. Like, to realize everyone's got their own life and their own circumstances that are swimming around in their head every day when they're at work, and we're only seeing a part of a person, and we have to appreciate that we're all human, and we all just need to have our best to be brought out in a spirit of empathy and caring.
Well said. I mean, that's really great parting words to leave us with today. I think that we all need connection, and I see it daily, in organizations. I see that, we've got all the cognitive pieces of what can be done, but it's also who are we being while we're doing things. And I think
Exactly.
that's really what you're talking about. So I really appreciate you spending the time with us today, Dr. Riess. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and I really commend you for the incredible work you do.